Uh, Matt has already given me an introduction, so I won't waste any of my time because I've got a lot to get through. So we're going to briefly go through a little bit of background history about what earthworms are. And then I'm going to talk about the different types of British earthworm that we have, and then how we go out and record them, and what we've learned over the past 8 years of earthworm recording. So I thought I'd start with the very basics. What is an earthworm? And I like to look at the word. So if we break it up into the two separate words that make up the word earthworm, the word earth can refer to a number of things, but in this case, we're talking about the substance of the land surface, so the soil. And worm can be used to describe a weak or despicable person, but in this case, what we're talking about is any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animal with long, slender, soft bodies and no limbs. So if we put them together, we get the dictionary definition for an earthworm, which is a burrowing annelid worm that lives in the soil, important in aerating and draining the soil and in burying organic matter. So that word annelid may not be familiar to everybody, so that helps us explain where earthworms fit within the animal kingdom. So Annelida, the annelids, are the segmented worms, and they're in a category that we call a phylum. And they break up into two main groups: the Polychaeta, the bristle worms, which include wonderful, scary-looking alien-type predators that you get living in marine environments, such as the bobbit worm, but also things that you may be familiar with, like lugworms and ragworms, and into the Clitellata as well. So the Clitellata, that breaks up into two main groups: the Hirudinea, which is the leeches, and the numbers that you can see within the order category there are the number of worldwide species that have been described. So there's a couple of different groups that you can group together. The Hirudinea are the true leeches, and we've got over 700 of them described worldwide. The other category, the sister group to the leeches, is the Oligochaeta, and this really is a very big and diverse group. We can see there's lots of different orders there, and they range from marine to freshwater to terrestrial. Many of them are freshwater. The one group there that you may be familiar with that's terrestrial are the potworms at Encutriida, and they are a group of tiny little earthworm-like creatures that you get in the soil, in plant pots, in compost, things like that. But you also get them around the world living in glaciers. So some potworms are known as iceworms. So fantastic little creatures, and that number of 750 species described worldwide will be a massive underestimate of how many there actually are, because in the UK I'm not aware of anybody studying them, and when I found quite big ones for Encutriids, even sending them off to Hungary, I haven't been able to get them identified. And then we also have the Crassiclitellata, which is the true earthworms, and over 5,000 species have been described around the world, and there's just over 20 families. We only have 3 families in the British Isles: the Lumbricidae, which is the ones that refer to as the native European worms, and then the Acanthrodrilidae and the Sparganophilidae. They both just have a single species within the UK. And they're probably species that have been introduced from elsewhere in the world. Both those species are very rare as well, so they're not non-native invasive species that we're worried about or anything like that. So that's a brief overview of where earthworms fit in the wider kingdom of life. Earthworms have also been around for quite some time. So if we look at this evolutionary timeline of when things developed, we can see that the first annelids, which would have been polychaete-like organisms, appeared over 500 million years ago. And the earthworm-like creatures, so the clitellates, the ancestral clitellate, would have appeared over 450 million years ago. So after fish, but before us and before many other things. The red crosses on this slide indicate mass extinction events. So the reason I've got this up here is just to show that Earthworm-like creatures have been around for a long, long time, a lot longer than us newcomers to the planet, and they've survived 5 mass extinction events. So they're here for the long run. Dinosaurs, if we look by comparison, they're a lot more recent than earthworm-like creatures, and they only survived 1 mass extinction event. The second one finished off the last of the dinosaurs. So I've got a little quiz for you now. I think I actually will have to launch this one. Where is it? There we go. I've got a little quiz for you. I want you to tell me if this earthworm is a adult or not. So true or false, is this earthworm an adult? So have a look at the picture. I'm not going to give you long to answer, so make a decision quick. And based on the picture, let me know if you think it's an adult or not. Okay, a couple more seconds. Get your vote in now. Okay, so we can see here 76% of you have said true, it is an adult, 24% false. It is actually an adult, and the reason we can tell, and where clitellates get their name from, is that they have what we call a clitellum here, this saddle-like feature. So I call it a saddle, but the scientific term for it is a clitellum. And any earthworm that has that clitellum is an adult, so they develop that feature when they become an adult. So this shows sexual maturity in the organism. All right, so that brings us to the life cycle of an earthworm. So all earthworms start life as what we call an earthworm cocoon. So it's not an earthworm egg because the cocoon encases the egg. So inside each of these cocoons, there will be an egg that will be developing with an earthworm developing inside. In here, we can see some evidence of the earthworm growing inside. It's hatched from its egg and now it's growing inside the cocoon. So earthworms can spend quite a bit of time in these cocoons. A couple of questions that I quite often get asked: how many fertilized eggs are in each cocoon? It can be between 1 and 20. UK species, or UK and Irish species, so the Lumbricidae family, tend to be 1, just a single, but elsewhere in the world it can be up to 20. So how many cocoons will an earthworm produce? Between 3 and 80, I believe that's a year. So again, varies a lot depending on the species, depending on the ecology, depending on food availability, environmental conditions. How long do earthworm cocoons take to hatch? Well, all those factors that can affect how many cocoons will be produced affect the hatching time as well. And it can be anywhere from 3 weeks to 5 months, depending on the species and those other conditions. And what factors may play a role in all the former? Well, like I said, species, nutrition and health of the parent, and environmental conditions. So we've got our earthworm cocoon. It hatches into a small earthworm. It will, when it hatches, it will have the correct number of segments for the same number of segments it will have as an adult, and it will grow into a juvenile. Now, the juveniles look just like an adult earthworm, minus the clitellum. So they'll have that pigmentation. If that species has pigmentation, they'll have the same number of segments, but they won't have the clitellum. Now, once they become adults, they do what adults do, and earthworms mate. So each earthworm has both male and female reproductive parts. So it's what we call a simultaneous hermaphrodite, meaning that when it mates with another earthworm, they both play the role of the male and female simultaneously. So what they will do here is they don't exchange any eggs, they just exchange sperm. So each earthworm gives its sperm to the other earthworm, which is then stored. So there's no contact between the sperm and the eggs during mating, or even just after mating. So what will happen is there's a feature called the male pore around here. It will release some sperm, because the earthworms will have released a mucus called a slime tube that helps them stick together. They also grip each other with their clitellums, a feature on there. The sperm will travel within the slime tube along the other earthworm, where it will be stored in a pouch-like feature they've got called spermatheca. so the earthworms have then exchanged sperms, and then they'll go their separate ways. What will then happen is the saddle will release more mucus, and it'll form what we call a mucus sheath. And this mucus sheath, after mating, will move down the earthworm, down the body of the earthworm towards the head. I suppose I should say up the body of the earthworm towards the head. As this mucus sheath moves up over the head, it will pick up its eggs, so the eggs of the earthworm in question, and then as it moves down a bit more, it will pick up the sperm from the earthworm that it mated with, the partner earthworm, and it will come off the end, and then the mucus will harden and form a lemon-shaped cocoon. And within that, you've got the egg and the sperm will fertilize the egg. So that's how we get baby earthworms. I've got another quick question for you here. True or false? Earthworms will drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding. What do people think there? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Do you think earthworms will drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding? We're a bit more divided on this one, I see. I'm going to end it there. Share the results. So 63% of you went for true and 37% went for false. It's actually false. So earthworms will not drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding. A lot of earthworms are really adapted to living in very wet conditions. And in fact, earthworms as a group of organisms, they come from the annelids. They don't have lungs. They breathe through moisture on their skin. So actually, if they dry out, that's more of a risk to them. So yeah, flooding will not drown earthworms. However, we've all seen earthworms floating dead in a pond, in a puddle after rain. So what's causing this? Well, what they can die from is if the water becomes anaerobic because all the oxygen is being used up, they can then die. But it wouldn't be drowning; it would be suffocating because they've used up all the oxygen in the substrate that they're living in. But even if that occurs, particularly in the UK where we're really wet, it's not going to be, even if it did kill off the entire earthworm population within an area because the water became, the ground became anaerobic, the next generation of earthworms are waiting it out in cocoons, so earthworm populations will recover really well. Oh, that. Right, okay, I've got another question for you now. That is, if you cut an earthworm in half, you get 2 living worms. Is that true or false? So we've all heard this before. Is it true or false? Okay, we're unanimous so far on this one. Anybody? Oh no, somebody's upset about. Brilliant. Right, okay, so just one of you has went for true and 19 have went for false. The truth is there isn't actually a correct answer to this because it could be both true or false. In general, earthworms, if you cut an earthworm in half, you would usually not get 2 living worms. However, some species do have fantastic regeneration abilities, and earthworms have been known to be grown even from a single segment. But in the wild, an earthworm is not going to last very long if it's a single segment. So really what I normally tell people is it depends on a few things. First of all, it depends on the species. Some species are really good at regenerating lost segments. Others are not so great at it. The larger species that we have in particular are not that great at it. If you cut an earthworm between its head and its saddle, chances are you might get 2 dead worms. If you cut it after the saddle, there's more of a chance of the head end surviving. But I have I have seen specimens where they've regrown a head. So it is possible, but unlikely. Usually you would just get one. And earthworms will sometimes even choose to lose their tail as a defense response to predation when they're stressed. So we call this process autotomy. It's the casting off of a part of the body, e.g. a tail, by an animal under threat. It's something that happens in lizards, for example, slow worms, but earthworms can also show this ability as well. Again, it will vary by species. Some species may do it, others may not. And the reason they do that, like I said, it's the tail can be a distraction while the rest of the earthworm gets away. Right, so that's a little bit of a background to earthworm. Oh, one more bit about earthworm biology. You may or may not have seen earthworms knotted up in a ball like this. When they're doing this, they're doing this to avoid environmental conditions that are not ideal for them. So that might be times when the ground is frozen. It might be in summer when it's too dry. When they do this, they're going into a state of hibernation. And what they'll do is they'll empty their guts, they'll slow down their metabolism and knock themselves in a ball and release a mucus to protect them from the environmental conditions that are surrounding them. They'll usually burrow quite deep to do it as well, and they'll stay in this state to try and wait out unfavorable conditions. Different species do it to different extents. So some will do it for very small periods of time, and as soon as the environmental conditions improve, they'll come out of this state. Others will do it at the same time every year. So varies a lot. We call it estivation in summer and hibernation in winter. I once got an email from somebody asking me what was going on here, and they said they thought the earthworm had been knotted in a ball, and they tried to help it out by unraveling it. You can imagine the earthworm probably wasn't too happy with being woken from its sleep by being unknotted by some human that was trying to help them, but yeah, not that helpful in reality. So that's a bit about earthworm biology. What about their ecology? So the father of earthworm ecology is Charles Darwin. He wrote a book on earthworms, which I recommend everybody reads, called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. It was published in 1881, and it was his biggest selling book during his lifetime. So it's a much better read than that other one he wrote that everybody goes on about. And within this book, he said that worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons at first suppose. So if Darwin was alive today, he might be the one actually running the recording scheme and giving you this talk today. So Darwin knew that earthworms were important. So let's have a look at how they're important. So we can break them up into 3 ecological categories. In the UK, we divide them up a little bit further into a 4th one, but really that 4th category is a subset of one of the others. So these are the Anesthetic, the Epigenic and the Endogenic earthworms, and they're categorized by where they live within the soil profile and the ecological function which they undertake. So going through them one by one, we've got the Anesthetic, Endogenic, Epigenic, and we're also going to add in a 4th category, the Compost, which is really a subset of the Epigenics, but we'll separate them out for the purpose of this talk. So starting with the Anesthetic earthworms, these are the ones that burrow the deepest. They're the deep burrowing earthworms, and they live in deep vertical burrows. So these are permanent burrows that they excavate out, and then they will line the side of these burrows with mucus so that it's a permanent home. So they're not just munching their way through the soil all the time, they live in a permanent home. And they will come to the surface at night to feed and mate. So they'll be feeding on leaves on the surface, but they're also deep burrowing earthworms. So they'll also be consuming the really nutrient poor deep soil. So within their body, within their digestive system, they're mixing up the leaves that they've eaten, the nutrient poor, which is nutrient rich, the nutrient poor deep soil, and then they're casting that out. So they're pooing that out, quite often on a lot of it actually on the surface, and they're providing a natural ploughing system for the earth. So we can tell these apart from the other categories of earthworms because they're big. These are the largest earthworms that we have. And in the UK, our biggest species, Lumbricus terrestris, the lobworm, can grow up to 40 centimetres long. There are earthworms bigger than that around the world, but yeah, in the UK, 40 centimetres long, which is massive for an invertebrate. So the sheer size of them helps us distinguish them from other types of earthworm, but also they've got this pigmentation. So when we talk about the colours of earthworms, we separate out colour and pigmentation. So pigmentation is where they've got these deep reddy, browny, purple, or even black colours to them. So with the Anesthetic earthworms, they have pigmentation, usually more so at the head end of the earthworm. And I can tell this is the head end because it's nearest to the saddle. The tail end is always further from the saddle and the head nearer the saddle. British earthworms usually about a third of the way along from the head. So they're often much darker towards the head end and they're much darker dorsally. So on their back, their underside might be a bit paler and much paler towards the tail. The Anesthetic earthworms also have this behavior where they can flatten their tail into a paddle shape, and that's because they use that to anchor themselves into their burrows while they're out feeding or mating. So if they get disturbed by a predator, they can quickly withdraw back into their burrow. So that's our Anesthetic earthworm. So how deep do Anesthetic earthworms burrow? This is from a study in 1953 looking at the depth that earthworms were found at from between January and December. We can see that the depth varies by species and it varies by time of year, environmental conditions. Lumbricus terrestris will go down as far as 2 meters. So it's our biggest one and it goes a lot further than the others. But yeah, you can see that these are even down past 45 centimeters. So they'll go down a fair distance. I think down to 75 centimeters usually, but Lumbricus terrestris even further down to 2 meters. So the next group we've got are the Endogenic earthworms. These are our shallow burrowing earthworms. So these live in the top layers of the soil. They live in semi-permanent horizontal burrows, so they will be making new burrows all the time, but they will reuse their burrows. They rarely come to the surface and they feed almost exclusively on soil. While they're eating the soil, there may be things like nematodes and things like microorganisms in the soil that they're digesting as well, but their food source is soil. Unlike the Anesthetic earthworms, Endogenic earthworms don't have any pigment. So you will get them in lots of different colours. You'll see them in greys, blues, pinks, browns, yellows, all sorts of different colours, but they don't have that pigmentation that the Anesthetic earthworms have. So if you find an earthworm and it looks a bit sickly when you're digging up your vegetable patch, it's likely to be one of these Endogenic earthworms. Size is a red herring when it comes to the Endogenics. You get them it says here medium to large, but you can actually get them being even fairly small. And the largest of the Endogenics, Octalasian cyanium, will give the Anesthetics a run for its money when it comes to size. So it can get over, yeah, it can get to 15 centimeters, no problem. So, and it's quite a big, chunky earthworm, but it just looks very, very pale. So those are the Endogenics. So how deep do they go? Well, you can see from this diagram, yet again, the same study, the depth varies depending on the time of year and the species. But we can see a lot of the time they are near to the surface. So they're in the top 15 centimeters of the soil. However, again, we've got another outlier. That Octalasian cyanium that I told you is the biggest of the Endogenics. That one will go down to 45 centimeters, no problem, fairly regularly. So it's a little bit of an anomaly. It seems to be something to do with size. The bigger the earthworm, the more they break the rules and the deeper they go for their category. Right, so those are all the earthworms that you tend to get living in the soil. We've also got the other 2 categories which tend to be found more often above ground. So we've got the Epigenic earthworms, which we refer to as the surface-dwelling earthworms. They will live in leaf litter, dung and deadwood. So they'll live in the substrate that they eat. These are the kind of things that they eat. And their yeah, feeding on any decaying plant matter and waste animal matter as well. Like the Anesthetic earthworms, they will have pigmentation. And usually, this one's a bit of a bad example actually, but usually that pigmentation will be a bit more uniform across the earthworm, so the tail end won't be as pale as you would get in an Anesthetic earthworm. So how do you tell an Epigenic from an Anesthetic earthworm? Well, it tends to be size. These are our smallest earthworms, the Epigenics. So these are much smaller in size. Our smallest Epigenic earthworm grows to just 1.5 centimeters. Well, I think it's between 1.5 and 4 centimeters as an adult, in contrast to the largest Anesthetic that can grow up to 40 centimeters. And then the final group, which is really a subset of those Epigenics, are the compost earthworms, and they live in pretty similar habitats, but they like it when that habitat is really, really nutrient rich. So you will get them in fresh dung, you'll get them in really, really rotten deadwood, and probably unsurprising to you all, you'll get them in your compost bins as well. Really interestingly, they're able to colonize these habitats, even though you rarely find them in the soil around. So how they find and colonize these habitats, these microhabitats, is a bit of a mystery. It might be that the cocoons are waiting in the soil for the right chemical cues, and when they occur, they find it, but we really don't know that much about it. So they can look like Epigenic earthworms as well, but two of the species can be quite stripy in appearance as well. They're a bit larger, they tend to be a bit larger than some of the Epigenics, the other Epigenics, but they have this banding that you can see. Now, people quite often see this banding and they assume it's the Icenia fetida, otherwise known as the tiger or brandling worm, but we actually have multiple species of compost earthworms, and in my opinion, they're some of the hardest to separate. I should point out here as well, these are the ecological categories, not the species. To differentiate between different species, you actually need to collect earthworms, preserve them. So you have to kill them and preserve them and look at them under a microscope. They cannot be identified in the field, unfortunately, in the UK. Around the rest of the world, they have to go a step further and dissect them. So you have to look at internal organs in order to be able to get a reliable identification. Right, so how do we go looking for earthworms? How do we record earthworms? Well, this is a bit of a barrier with earthworm recording, because earthworms don't just fly by like a butterfly. They don't come to our bird feeders in our gardens. So, and they don't leave signs around that enable us to identify them species. So the best way to find earthworms is to actually go digging and look for them within the soil. So soil pit sampling involves digging out a square of soil, a cube of soil, and hand sorting through it to find any earthworms and take them away for identification. In the UK, the Earthworm Society, the National Earthworm Recording Scheme, advised that we don't take any juveniles because they can't be identified. It's all about that Clitellum, that saddle, and where that is when we're IDing. So it's only adults that should be collected. And usually when I'm sampling, I find that the proportion of adults to juveniles is usually quite low. So you get a lot more juveniles than adults, and they're returned to the soil. So soil pit sampling is one way of recording earthworms. If you've got an area that you can't dig in, or you just don't want to dig, another way of getting earthworms out of the ground is to use what we call a vermifuge. So vermi means worm, fuge means to separate, and what this does is it separates the earthworms from the soil. So it's an irritant to the earthworms and it brings them out of the ground. Different vermifuges have been used throughout time. So we've got formalin, potassium permanganate, a mustard powder solution and washing up liquid. I don't use formalin or potassium permanganate. They're quite dangerous chemicals and they're really damaging to the environment as well. Mustard powder is probably the best solution. It's the most environmentally friendly, and it's safe for us to use. I tend not to use washing up liquid solution because, again, I don't really know what the impacts on the environment are, and it seems to be quite nasty with the earthworms, whereas a mustard powder is more of an irritant. A washing up liquid seems to kind of mess up their their mucus on the outside. I think it probably kills them as well. So it's not a nice thing to use. So how do we do our earthworm sampling? We've got different methods there. If we want to sample a site for earthworms and do a bit of a survey, see what we've got there, digging one soil pit is not enough. That won't give you a representative sample of the species that might be on a site. So what we will do is, if we go to a site, we'll always do our transects within a given habitat. So we wouldn't do 2 soil pits in a woodland and 2 soil pits in a grassland and combine the results, because you get different earthworms living in different habitats. So here we've got a very basic habitat. We've got a woodland, we've got a couple of trees, and we've got a river. First transect I would possibly do is in the woodland, and I'd dig 5 soil pits. I'd space them about 5 to 10 meters apart in that formation, and that would give me an okay representation of the type of earthworms that we've got living in the soil in the woodland. I could do the same in the grassland, and those would be 2 different transects, because we've got different habitats there. And if you've got a linear habitat, like a hedgerow or a river, like on this, you can do a linear transect along there. So those are different ways of getting doing a bit of a more structured survey. If you're sampling the soil like this, so you're only ever going to get some of those ecological groups, you're unlikely to get much in the way of epigeic and endogenic, epigenic and compost earthworms. So another thing that's really important is to search microhabitats, and that can be things like wet patches, compost, grass clippings, other decaying plant material, leaf litter, under stones, the base of trees. In trees, you get some earthworms that climb up trees and live in the rot holes in trees, manure, dead wood, under bark, under moss, under plant pots. There's many different microhabitats that you can search. So now we've got our earthworms, how do we ID them? Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to teach you how to ID earthworms in this workshop, because it really does require a microscope. And although earthworms are not hugely difficult, it's good to have had some training before you do. And I'm just going to stop there and launch a quick poll, because I wondered if people know how many species we've got in the British Isles. So this is the UK island and Channel Islands. There's a quick poll there. It's anonymous, so I can't see who's answering what. But if you let me know how many species you think we've got in the British Isles. And I'm just thinking, Natalie, did we tell them this in the description? We may have.
I can't recall, Keiron, but yeah. Hopefully they won't look it up.
Yeah. So they're invertebrate crew. Now, there's a bit of a clue earlier on. I did say how many species we've got worldwide. Yeah, okay, I'm going to end that poll there. If you haven't got your vote in, very quick. All right, let's see what people went with. Well, the most popular answer was 31, and then it kind of tapers off each way. That's correct. In the UK and Ireland, we've got 31 species. In Great Britain, we've only got 29. Because 2 of them have only ever been found in Ireland, but there is potential that they could be found in the rest of the UK as well. Earthworms are massively under-recorded. So yeah, 31 different species. So they're a reasonable group to get your head around as well. So the recommended ID resource that we've got is from the organisation that I work for, the Field Studies Council, and that's the Key to the Earthworms of the UK and Ireland. It's currently on the 2nd edition. It's a really nice key. It's really easy to use. It's designed for amateur naturalists, not for taxonomists. So the way that you work through the key, it makes sure the easier questions are first and the harder questions are later on, and only needed where necessary. So what ID features do we have on when we're IDing UK earthworms? I'm going to quickly whiz through this, but like I said, we're not going to be able to teach this on a virtual workshop, because you really do need a microscope ID course. And I'm hoping to come up to Scotland or send one of my fellow earthwormers over to do one of these courses maybe next year. So Earthworm ID 101 is the saddle. If it hasn't got the saddle, we don't try and ID it. It's not an adult. And this is where most of the features are that we're going to be looking at. Now with earthworms, it's all about counting what segments things are on. We start off looking at earthworm morphology. They've got a head going down the earthworm. You've then got a feature called the male paw. Then you've got the saddle, which has a feature on it called the tubercular pubitatis, or the TP. And then you've also got these dots running along. These are little tiny hairs called setae, and we look at how closely they are paired. So earthworms have a back and an underside, and whatever we've got on one side is repeated on the other. So looking at the head first, there's two different types of head, and this is the first question in the key. We look at whether it's got what we call a epilobic head or a tanalobic head. And an epilobic head means that these two grooves here don't come all the way to the next segment. So this is segment 1 here. This is what we call the prostomium. And this is segment 2. So the lines don't come all the way down. A tanalobic head is where the lines come all the way down. And if we look at that in some real examples, we can see that the lines come part way down here and all the way down there. Not always as easy to see as that, I'm afraid. And epilobic heads can be really variable and sometimes almost impossible to see, even down the microscope. So if you can't see anything, usually that means it's epilobic. The next feature we've got is the male paw, and we count what segment that is on. It's usually on 15 in British species, but there are a couple of exceptions, and that's a key ID feature for those species. It can be like a raised one where it looks like a little mouth on the side of the worm. It can be a slit. Or like this one here, it can be hardly visible, or you might even not be able to see it at all with the naked eye, with a microscope even, the ×30 microscope. Next feature along, we've got the clitellum, and what we're looking at here is where the clitellum starts and where it ends. When you're looking at the clitellum, you always count the segments underneath, because that's where the segmentation is easiest to see, but you need to look at the top, because sometimes it might look like it ends earlier underneath than it really does, because we can see here it goes on to part of that segment there. So if we say, for example, this is segment 30, we'd count that as 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and then that one would count as 35. Now on the TP, on the clitellum, there's a feature called the TP. On this one here, it's this scar-like thing here. And it can be all sorts of different shapes. It's the key feature when identifying earthworms. It's that feature that is a little bit different usually on most species. So we're looking at the shape. So here we've got what is called a thick band. Here we've got what we call 2 bumps. And we're looking at what segment numbers it starts and ends on. And once you've become well versed in Earthworm ID, quite often it's this feature that you'll skip straight to, and that might give you the species. If you think of an earthworm like a clock, if you chop a segment, you think of the round earthworm like a clock, it's between 4 and 5 o'clock and 6 and 7 o'clock on the earthworm. The setae, so I said about the setae, now this is the trickiest part of Earthworm ID, because sometimes the setae can be really, really difficult to see, and we're looking at whether they're closely paired, like in this one here, or whether they're widely paired. And I know a lot of you will be looking at these photos thinking, wow, I can barely tell the difference between them. And it is tricky. It is tricky, and this is the main reason why people, I think, need to come on an ID course to be able to learn how to do it. If we look at some examples as well, like this is a really good example, because this is a species that has probably the widest pairing of all. Some are less obvious. What I tend to do is look for lines rather than looking for individual hairs. So I can see there's 2 lines running here, and they're fairly close together. With the widely paired ones, you normally need to look for 4 lines to make sure that you're getting two pairs. And I can see there's a line here, a line here, a line here, a line there, and none of them are particularly close to each other, so they'd be classed as widely paired. Like I said, don't expect you to pick this up on this talk. It's one for a workshop in the lab. So when we're counting, we always count from segment 1 we count along and we mark where things are. So this is an example of an earthworm where I've taken a photo and I've mapped out all the numbers. So where the Clitellum starts, where it ends, where the TP is, the shape. And what I will do when I'm identifying earthworms is I'll use this table that I've designed and I'll mark down all of the features. Because we haven't got very many different features, I mark it down for every earthworm ID, and then I take that information through the key rather than going through the key first, because the key will chop and change what it's asking you about. So it'll ask you about the head, then it might ask you about the Clitellum, then the TP, then the Clitellum again, then the TP again. So if you've got the information written down, it makes it much easier. Right, final bit, and then I'll hand over to questions. What we've went out and we've looked for earthworms and we've identified them. So what is the situation with recording earthworms in the UK? So this is a map of peacock butterfly records from 2009. And on here, we've got two data sets between 1995 and 99 and between 2005 and 2009. And we can see there's loads of dots on this map, and we've got so much information here. We can even look at things like range expansion. So the data is telling us stuff about the population ecology of this species. If we go back to 2009 and look at earthworm records, a paper that was published in 2009 mapped all records. One thing we can see here is there's a lot less money in mapping earthworm records versus butterfly records. And this isn't one species, this is all 31 species of earthworm in the British Isles. And they've been mapped here, and we can see that there's a lot less dots on the map. So does this mean we've got less earthworms than we've got peacock butterflies? I very much doubt it. Does it mean that whales?
Hi, Keiron, are you still there?
Yeah, Natalie, can you still hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, sorry, Keiron. I don't know if it was my end.
Okay,
just
no
briefly cut out. You were saying, does this mean that earthworms are?
Okay, I was just saying, does this mean that earthworms are not present in these areas? Yeah. Probably not. It means that earthworms are dramatically under-recorded. So off the back of that scientific paper that evidence that our knowledge of earthworm distributions in the UK and Ireland is particularly poor, the Earthworm Society of Britain was set up in 2009. So it's a volunteer-run organisation that is all about furthering our understanding of earthworm science.
Sorry about that. Looks like we've lost Keiron for a second. Hopefully he'll come back.
Oh, I seem to have got booted out.
Oh dear.
No, it's fine. We'll get back. You can see that, yeah?
Yes, Scan, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So do you want to turn your video off, perhaps?
Yeah.
That might help. Thank you.
Yeah. In 2009, Earthworm Society of Britain was formed. 2014, we launched the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. And then since then, the recording scheme and the society have gone from strength to strength. We began working with the FSC, teaching people how to identify earthworms. We began sharing our data through the NBN Atlas and making earthworm research data sets available publicly. We released guidance on how to record earthworms in 2017 through the publicly available Earthworm Recorders Handbook. When I got the funding for the Bilinks project, we stepped up our recording then. And in 2019, so just 5 years after launching, we won the NBN award for open data. So it was recognised that we're making all of our data available full resolution with no restrictions. And by as of today, our records have been downloaded 702,704 times from the NBN Atlas. And also as of today, our data, which is also available through the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, has been cited in 21 different research papers and reports. So our data is not only there available, it's being used as well. We take great pride in sharing our data. Oh, that must be coming later. So where are we at in terms of records? Isle of Man is sitting with 0 records. We've not had any records from the Isle of Man, so that's somewhere that we want to get to within the British Isles. The Channel Islands, we've got 100 records there, which we got through actually going there and teaching and sampling ourselves. Northern Ireland has got 868, Wales 324, Republic of Ireland 2,291, Scotland, our second biggest with 2,380, and in England we've got 14,246. A large part of that is due to research data sets that we've managed to secure from other organisations. So what does this mean about our knowledge of earthworm distributions? Well, this is a map from 2020 versus a map from 2009, and you can see that we've filled in a lot more gaps there. There's still a lot more gaps to fill in Scotland, and that's one of the reasons why I was particularly keen to do this talk. Most of our data from Scotland comes from academic research. We haven't really got much in the way of active earthworm recorders up in Scotland, so I recognise we do need to come up there and do a bit of training. So yeah, if we look at Scotland in a bit more detail, there are huge gaps around some of the Outer Hebrides, large parts of northern Scotland. I'm aware that some of these areas, there's large gaps for a lot of different species as well. And then Orkney and Shetland, we could always do with more as well. Okay, so collating and sharing records. So we try and make sure that our records are available to as many different organisations as possible. We share them locally by emailing them through the Association of Local Environmental Record Centres to the record centres that are registered with them, which includes accredited with them, which includes TWIC. And Natalie will be pleased to hear that I've got data that's coming soon. Before I send it off, I'm just trying to sort out some Northern Ireland data. We share it nationally through at least biannual uploads to the NBN Atlas, and we share it internationally through the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So what I want to point out here is any earthworm data that comes directly to me or to iRecord will end up eventually with the record centres, the NBN and GBIF. So please do send your records into iRecord. We've got a specific earthworm form there that you can use, and we'll be able to go through that data and give you feedback. And if it passes the verification checks, we can add it to our data sets. So what has this meant for our data? Well, if we look at 2009, a Natural England report mapped out how many earthworms belong to each species from the data that was available. And what we can see here is that Natural England was stating that 34.06% of earthworms from surveys were belonging to this Ecological chlorotica, which is a little green worm, loves disturbed soil. And it's over a third of the earthworms that were found in their data. And this was a collation of different research data sets. And we can see there's quite a steep curve here. So a lot of earthworms seem to be quite rare, and some are very, very rare and not even present in the data sets. In 2014, I took the data that Natural England had used, I added our data to it, and I redid this graph, and I got this. What we can see is, first of all, this is a lot less of a steep curve. That means that the data here is very, very biased towards certain habitats and certain sampling methods, because it was all research data. Most research is done in woodlands or agricultural settings. So things like Icenia fetida, which you find in compost heaps, was not getting picked up. It's here at 0.65% of earthworms. Here it's at 4.9, and that will continue to rise, and it will have risen since then. We see that Flora chlorotica, which the Natural England report stated was over a third of all earthworms, it is still pretty widespread, pretty common, but it's not even the most recorded species anymore. It's down to second place, and it's dropped back to a third of the percentage that it was. So by getting people to go out and record in lots of different habitats and use lots of different recording methods, we've been able to get a better understanding of a wider range of species. And our recorders have even picked up very, very rare species. So Dendrobrina pygmaea was a very, very rare species that we can see is sat here at 0. And Natural England were about to declare it extinct in Great Britain, or thought to be extinct in Great Britain. And I told them not to do that because we'd had some records. And since 2014, we've now had 10 different records all across England. So it'd be great to find this in Scotland as well. We can even start using the data that we've got to inform us about where we can go recording. So Lumbricus frendi is one of our rarest species. And when that's been mapped using data from across Europe and a clever modelling system, we can now look at why it's rare. And it looks like Great Britain is actually not that suitable for it. So the darker red, the more suitable the area is for that species. And it tells us where we might be able to find it in the UK. So that's pointing to Hastings. I did go down and try and find it, but I wasn't able to. So I'll finish up quickly. What can you do to further your understanding of earthworms and contribute to the Earthworm Recording Scheme? Well, you can come on one of our training courses. So we've got different training courses that we run. Most of these are in person. So I'm aware we need to do much more in Scotland. We do have our Discovering Earthworms course, which is online. That's running from the 25th of October to the 29th of November with the Field Studies Council. It's subsidised by BioLink, so it's available. It's a 4-week online course. It's available for just £20. Now, this isn't an ID course. It's all about the ecology and biology of earthworms, but it gives you a great foundation in earthworms before coming on our other stuff, and I highly recommend it. From next year, it will be £60 plus. So this is the last chance to book on that. And you can find details of that on the Earthworm Society of Britain website. If you want to know more about recording earthworms and read our reports when they're released and get details of training courses and talks such as this coming up, then go onto the Earthworm Society of Britain's website, click on the Recording Earthworms page, and there's a sign up subscribe thing there to subscribe to that mailing list. Highly recommend it. I'll drop the link in the chat after the talk. And I send no more than 3 emails a year, so you won't get spammed with loads of earthworm stuff. And I'll call it time on that. Sorry.